Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul. Hopefully you're having an amazing day. We've got some excellent news if you're interested in Intel's Alder Lake series of processors, at least when it comes to gaming. So Intel are expected to announce Alder Lake at the Innovation event, which is going to be taking place late October. And naturally, we will see Alder Lake debut alongside new motherboards. They're the Z690s, just for your FYI. And these boards will support DDR4 as well as 5, and also PCIe Gen 5 as well. But the real pièce de résistance, of course, is a brand new processor architecture. We've discussed the high-performance cores and energy-efficient cores several times in the past, but the bottom line is that Intel finally seems to be able to compete with AMD, as there have been a couple of benchmarks uploaded to the Ashes of the Singularity database. Now, before we go into the benchmarks themselves, it is worth noting that there is a per-run variance in Ashes of the Singularity database. In fact, when I used to use it for my own benchmarking, sometimes I would curse. Okay, quite a lot of the times I would curse at just how inconsistent it could sometimes be. But nevertheless, there are a couple of very interesting results here. One individual, Evan Stenger, I'll link his Twitter account in the video description, has managed to actually find a pretty much like-for-like result, comparing the RTX 3080 powered 12900K against a 3080 powered 5950X. And you can see yourself here the difference in performance between the two CPUs. Bottom line is, in terms of frame rate anyway for CPU, you're looking around 104 for the 5950X compared to 132 for the 12900K. And this is running at 1440p. There are also some other results, such as a 1080p result, albeit using some custom settings, and it's scoring around 160 FPS again at 1080p, with a preset score of 15,900, which is very impressive indeed. Now, again, I just want to make certain that people understand that there is a per run variance here, but nevertheless it does seem that the 12900K is performing very well. Personally, I think that it's, well, pretty much a shoo-in that the 12900 as well as Alder Lake in general will outperform Zen 3. I mean, when you think about it, it just makes logical sense for gaming anyway, because, well, quite frankly, it's just a newer architecture. The real question for me anyway is how it will perform against the Ryzen V-Cache processors, where basically AMD have taken the Zen 3 architecture and just threw a bunch of cache on it. And I have to say that AMD's preliminary results in games such as Gears, well, yeah, you can see yourself on screen. It's very impressive indeed. In fact, I was told that this might be a little conservative for the final performance of the CPU, but at the end of the day, we don't have one, of course, available for testing. Now, a little bit about that actually. I was told that these CPUs will launch this year by a couple of individuals, and they've given me very accurate information in the past, but I don't know whether this is still the case, simply because, well, let's just be honest, releases and timings have been a little bit up in the air this year in general. Now, personally, I wouldn't be surprised if AMD does attempt to get the CPUs out this year, because it just looks good to have a highly competitive product in benchmarks, but whether they will or whether these products will slip until next year, I honestly don't know. I must confess, Alder Lake and Raptor Lake I'm actually genuinely excited for. Rocket Lake I was somewhat interested in just because obviously it was a backport and there was an air of just, I wonder how this actually does in reality. But with Alder Lake onwards, I do feel genuinely that Intel will be competitive, at least in gaming. It'll be very interesting though to test this across a myriad of different applications, whether it's 3D rendering or compiling or gaming or, you know, content creation or whatever the hell. It's going to be a very interesting product, I feel. PCIe Gen 5 is probably not going to be something that the majority of us are going to take advantage of. Maybe in some niche scenarios, if you do like a lot of video editing and you've got the ability to really like saturate a network, it could be, useful in certain scenarios. And if you load your device up with a ton of really fast drives, and even then, yeah, it's not really something that the average customer is going to necessarily use. But it's going to be very interesting anyway to see how Intel actually do here. So one small wrinkle to all of this, and it concerns a beta opt-in which seems to be used for the benchmarks here for the 12900K, as well as the 5950X in the results we've shown you. So if you take a look at the forums for Ashes of the Singularity, you will see that in September of this year, that's 2021, a 3.1 opt-in was released, and again, this is a beta. If you look over at the changelog, there's a very interesting point here. Max threads have increased from 16 to 24 to increase performance as many machines now have more CPU cores, which does make an awful lot of sense. But this means a couple things. The first is that the 5950X, well, obviously that's 16 cores, 32 threads, so some of those threads are just basically doing nothing and twiddling their fingers. And the second is that we're not exactly certain how this is going to scale for Alder Lake, since at the moment we don't really have a ton of game benchmarks, and that's putting it mildly, for Alder Lake. Now, yeah, I'm kind of interested to why they've only chosen to go to 24 threads. It's possibly something to do with the limitation of the engine or some other reason, but it is an interesting number that we see here for 24 rather than 32. Now, I don't think anything untoward's happened. I don't think Intel are bribing them because, quite honestly, yeah, I mean, it's a cool game and everything, and we do see a ton of leaks for Ashes of the Singularity, but it's not exactly like the de facto benchmarking application now for a lot of reviewers for CPUs. So yeah, I don't think anything weird's happening. I just wanted to bring it to your attention. I'd also like to give credit, by the way, to Hans on Twitter for this discovery. So again, I'll link his Twitter account in the description. And yeah, one final story that I'd like to quickly cover, because a couple of people were asking me my opinion about this. I got a couple of DMs about this, and that is that Eurogamer recently did quite an exhaustive investigation as the new PlayStation 5. I'm sure many of you are aware that basically there was a whole thing where basically Sony have released a new version of the PS5, and long story short, a big YouTuber covered it and said that the new PS5 is worse because the heat which was being output at the back of the console was higher, and they came to the conclusion therefore that the system itself is inferior. Games Nexus and Eurogamer did a really big kind of collaboration, and they found that, well, that's just not true. Essentially, the temperature of the SoC and memory and so on is essentially identical within a little bit of variance between the new and the old model. And also Igor's lab did temperature testing as well, and Eurogamer did frame rate testing. But that's not the reason I'm bringing that up into the video. Instead, there's a very interesting thing that has been discovered. I'll link their podcast in the video description. But basically, bottom line is there seems to be a new firmware for the PlayStation 5, which is now publicly available. Now, of course, with frame rate testing, there is a degree of variance just naturally, and this is particularly true when you're dealing with like random effects like particle generation. You can definitely have a little bit of variance, and even when you're like just ever so slightly having the camera at a different angle. However, to my understanding, they basically had a like-for-like comparison using, let's say, Control's photo mode. So they had Control, and I believe it was Devil May Cry. Bottom line is then that there was about a 3% improvement in performance with this new firmware. So as for the reasons that we could see this improvement in performance, and bear in mind it is just a couple of percent, we're not looking at a huge increase in frame rate, we're talking 1, maybe 2 frames per second, depending obviously of the frame rate target of the game itself. But the reasons could be numerous. The most obvious one is that there's just some improvements in the back end of the OS/drivers. It seems to particularly impact ray traced scenes from what Richard was stating over at Digital Foundry. So it's definitely possible that there could be a driver update or a small, update in general to the OS which improves things. It could even be something like the OS reserve itself has been slightly diminished in terms of its reserve, because we know, for example, that the OS reserve could be for the CPU, and it could even be a very small amount of GPU performance as well. So it's possible that we could see a slight reduction here. In fact, this wouldn't be the first time. Microsoft and Sony have routinely reduced the OS footprint of their consoles after launch. Like we saw, for example, Sony reduce the size of the allocation of the PS3's OS from main system memory. Remember, the PS3 had that kind of bifurcation between GPU memory and you know, main system memory, so it wasn't you know, unified like, let's say, the Xbox 360 was at the time. And Microsoft too, they reduced the footprint of the Xbox 360's OS, and one of the reasons that they can do this is it's better to be kind of cautious and optimistic and then say, well, you know what, we actually don't need all of this reserve, because you can't take backsies, you know, you can't give a developer, let's just be really simple here, and you can't say to a developer, you've got, you know, 7 gigabytes of 8 gigabytes, and then, like, you know, a couple of years later, actually, you know what, we're going to need another 512 megabytes back because we're going to be incorporating this feature. Obviously you cannot do that, so instead that it's better to sometimes over allocate what the OS requires. So it could be something like that, or it even could be something more complicated to do with the boosting algorithm on the APU. However, it's possible that it is pretty simple, just something to do with the optimization of the OS or something along those lines. With that said though, thank you very much for checking out the video. I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.